The ash was falling on a cloudless day. Delilah saw it first from Nightscale's back, 200 feet above the green hills east of Valcrest. A fine gray snow that should not have existed under that bright morning sun. It clung to the leaves of the apple orchards. It dusted the white wool of the sheep grazing along the boundary road. It settled on her shoulders as Nightscale banked left, and when she rubbed it between her fingers, it left a smear like spent fire on her skin. "You smell it." Beneath her, the dragon's vast body rippled with what would have been a shrug in a smaller creature. The bond carried his answer before he shaped it into words. That scent he had not been able to name even after 20 years of imprisonment. The one that had crept through the dungeon stone every full moon and made him strain against chains that nothing else could rattle. "I smell it. It is not new. It feels new. It is older than your kingdom, little Dragonheart. It is the breath of the place beneath places." She did not ask him to translate. He had been doing this for 2 months now, speaking in pieces, letting her assemble them, and she had learned that pressing for clarity drove him quieter, not the opposite. He was a creature accustomed to being asked the wrong questions for the entertainment of cruel men. Patience was the only correct posture with him. So she watched the orchards roll past below her and let the ash settle on her sleeves and tried to remember if the wind that morning had carried any direction at all. It had not. The pennants on the watchtower had hung perfectly still as she walked out to meet him in the courtyard. The herald birds had not flown. Nightscale's wings cupped the rising heat off the river bend, and they began their slow descent toward what had once been Grimhold Arena and was now something else. The new sanctuary occupied the bowl where the killing ground had been. 2 months of work had cleared most of the broken stadium walls, quarry teams hauling stone away in ox carts, masons cutting what remained into garden terraces, 100 former prisoners now drawing wages instead of dying for them. Where the iron gates had stood, there was now a wide-open archway hung with green linen banners. Where the holding cells had been, there was now a small infirmary with whitewashed walls and beds with real sheets. Where Lord Ashford's private box had brooded above the sand like a vulture's perch, there was now nothing at all. The stones had been carted away to build a wall around the orphans' quarters. Delilah had insisted on that. She wanted the watching seat to become a sleeping place. Nightscale settled in the central plaza with the same care he had been practicing since his first flight, wings folding inward in stages, claws finding the bare stone instead of the new flower beds, his great head lowering to her height as she swung down from his shoulder. A small crowd of workers had gathered already. They no longer scattered when he landed. Some of them, the bolder ones, the ones who had once worked the arena's pulleys and gates, actually waved. A young woman she did not recognize was running across the plaza toward her. "My lady, Lady Delilah!" She still flinched at the title. 2 months, and she still flinched. "There's a child, a girl. They brought her up from the southern road. They say, Father Owain says you have to see her." "How old?" 7, maybe 8. She doesn't speak much." Delilah looked at Nightscale. He had already turned his amber eye toward the infirmary at the far edge of the plaza. The bond carried it before the woman could finish, a low hum behind her sternum, the kind she had felt only one other time in her life. Standing in a cell beneath an arena on the night before she was meant to die. "She is one of us. The blood sings." Father Owain was waiting under the infirmary's eaves. He was a small, wiry man in his 60s, more weather than skin, with the calloused hands of someone who had spent most of his life copying out manuscripts and most of the remainder digging gardens. He had walked into the sanctuary 3 weeks after the arena's fall, asked who was in charge, and offered his services as keeper of records on the grounds that he was the last living scribe of the Aldermoot order, and the only person in Valcrest who could still read the dragon script that was now appearing in flecks of red light along the seams of every old wall in the kingdom. Delilah had hired him within the hour. He looked grim today. He looked grim most days.
In here. Walk softly. She has not stopped looking at the door.
The infirmary smelled of clean linen and the lavender they grew in the south garden. On the second cot from the window, a small girl sat cross-legged with her back against the headboard. Dark curls, a scraped knee, a dress that was 3 sizes too large, and tied at the waist with what looked like a length of old rain. She was holding a wooden cup of water in both hands and watching the doorway with the still, unblinking attention of an animal that had decided it would not be the first to move. Her eyes were hazel, almost exactly Delilah's color. This is Mira. She came north with a slaver's caravan out of the salt ports. The Hethrit guard ambushed them at the river crossing yesterday. 6 children freed. 5 had families to send for. Mira did not. The captain of the guard had heard about what we are doing here. He sent her up. How did you know? She bled on the threshold stone when they carried her in. There is a small chip of basalt set in the lintel, old quarry work, nothing anyone would notice. It hummed for me when she crossed. Delilah crouched at the side of the bed, slowly, hands open. Mira's eyes shifted from the doorway to her face and did not move again. My name is Delilah. Mira said nothing. I have a dragon. A blink. The first one since they had entered. His name is Nightscale, and he is the size of a small ship, and he is in the courtyard outside this building. He won't come in. He is too polite. Would you like to meet him? The cup tilted slightly in Mira's hands. Water slid down the inside of her wrist. She did not seem to notice. He won't eat me? He won't eat anyone. He says he tried roasted boar once during the dark times, and he found it disagreeable. The smallest twitch at the corner of the child's mouth. Not a smile. Closer to a doubt. Roasted boar is good. He has opinions. Mira set the cup down on the bedside table without spilling any more of it. She slid off the cot. She slipped her small hand into Delilah's without ceremony, the way a person who has been alone for a long time takes a hand the moment one is offered, as if she had already calculated whether it was safe and decided yes, and now intended to use it. They walked out into the plaza together. Nightscale was already crouched, head lowered to the flagstones, one amber eye fixed at the child's height. He did not move as they approached. He had been a dragon long enough to know that the smaller the thing you wanted to befriend, the more still you had to become. Mira walked up to him without slowing. She stopped 6 inches from his snout. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up, very carefully, and put her palm flat against the broad bridge of his nose. The black scales there were warm. Delilah had grown so used to that warmth, she had forgotten it was strange. Good dragon. Nightscale exhaled, a long, slow plume of air, scented with sulfur and old smoke, that lifted the child's curls and made her laugh. A real laugh, sharp and surprised, the kind of sound a person makes when they have just remembered they are allowed to. It was at that exact moment that the ash began to fall. Not in the orchards this time, not in the distance. Here, in the plaza, a gray snow drifting down out of a sky that was still impossibly blue, settling on Nightscale's spread wings, on Mira's curls, on the rim of the empty fountain. Delilah lifted her face to it and watched a single flake land on her lower eyelash and dissolve, leaving a small, dark smear, like burned paper. Workers in the plaza stopped what they were doing. One of the masons, an older man named Hollis, took off his hat and held it palm up. A flake landed in it. He stared down into the crown of his hat as if a coin had fallen there from a great height. "That's not from a fire." The ground moved, not violently, not enough to throw anyone down. A low, slow shudder under the soles of Delilah's boots, the way a sleeping body might shift beneath a thin blanket. The fountain water rippled in concentric rings outward from its center. Mira looked up at her with hazel eyes gone wide. "That happened in my village, before they came." Delilah was still trying to work out who they might be when the bells of the eastern watchtower began to ring. 2 riders came in through the open archway 20 minutes later, both of them gray to the eyebrows with the same ash, both of their horses lathered and shaking. The taller one fell out of his saddle before anyone could help him down and lay on the flagstones gasping. The shorter one, a woman, hard-faced, perhaps 40, stayed mounted long enough to deliver her message and then slid sideways into the arms of one of the masons. "Grayvale," she said. "The southern crossroads town. 340 souls. Gone. Not burned. Not slaughtered exactly. Just gone. Houses still standing. Doors still open. Bread still on the tables. But no people. No bodies. Only a black ash dusted over everything. And in the central square where the well had been, a hole. A clean, round hole punched through stone and earth, 4 feet across, going down and down and down past where the light could follow. And around that hole, the woman said, her voice cracking, the cobbles had been rearranged, lifted and reset in a spiral, as if someone with very patient hands had pulled them up one by one and put them back in a pattern." "What pattern?" He had appeared at Delilah's elbow without her noticing. The woman closed her eyes. "A wheel. 7 spokes." Owain went the color of milk. Delilah found him in the archive an hour later. She had left Mira with the infirmary matron and a promise to return before sundown. She had left the refugees with food, with bathwater, with a bed each. She had left Nightscale circling slow over the southern road, watching for whatever else might be coming in behind them. The archive was the only building in the sanctuary complex with a lock. Owain had insisted on it. Inside, 2 long oak tables ran the length of a stone-vaulted room that had once been the arena's tax office. The walls had been fitted with shelves now, and the shelves had been filled with whatever Owain could rescue or trade or buy back from the noble estates that had collapsed when Ashford's network of patronage went up in flames. 47 manuscripts, 3 rolls of birch bark codex from the eastern monasteries, 2 crates of unsorted vellum, and, propped against the far wall under an oilcloth, the slab. The slab had been pulled out of the foundations of the arena during the demolition. A piece of the bonding altar, a flat shard of dark stone the size of a tabletop, etched on one face with script in a language no one but Owain could read. Owain was standing over it when she came in. He was holding a lantern up to one corner of the slab and breathing very carefully through his nose. "What does it say?" "It says what I have been afraid it says for 6 weeks. He turned. He looked at her. He looked like a man who had been hoping he was wrong about something for a long time and had just run out of reasons to hope. "The bonding altar wasn't an altar, Lady Delilah. It was a lock." She waited. "There are 7 of them, set across the old kingdoms. They were placed there 400 years ago after the last war, the war the histories do not tell, when the dragons and the Dragonhearts decided together that what they had fought, could not be killed, and could only be shut away. Each lock was bonded to a dragon. Each dragon was bonded to a Dragonheart. The 7 seals held the door closed. The door to what? He did not answer. He turned the lantern. The light shifted across the slab. Letters that she had thought were ornamental flickered, and shapes she had taken for cracks in the stone resolved into a single phrase that she suddenly, terribly, could read. She could read it because her blood had touched the same stones 2 months ago, because the bond had taught her, in the way it taught her everything, by feeling. The hollow beneath the world. The breach at Greyvale. Is the first seal failing? Yours, the one you broke. To free Nightscale. To free Nightscale, yes. To free your bonded dragon and save your own life and stop a man who deserved stopping and end a great evil. He set the lantern down very carefully on the corner of the slab. All of which was true. All of which was good. And all of which has cracked the first of 7 locks holding back something we put away 400 years ago for very good reasons. Outside, very faintly, a horn began to blow on the southern walls. Not the bell pattern for raiders, not the pattern for fire. A long single note that the kingdom had not used in living memory, that Delilah had only ever heard described in stories. The pattern reserved, by the old laws, for an army. The ground shuddered again, slower, deeper. Beneath them, far beneath them, something that had been listening for 400 years lifted its head. 30 miles north, in the half-rebuilt herb garden of the Denilson Manor, Lord Richard Denilson laid down his trowel and listened. He had been kneeling between the marjoram and the dwarf laurel for most of the morning, replanting the rosemary border his wife had set down 20 years ago, and that had run wild and gone leggy in the 5 years since her death. He had not been particularly successful at it. He was a poor gardener and had been honest with himself about this for some time. He had taken it up anyway, in the first weeks after the arena's fall, because there was a stone bench beside the rosemary border on which Evelyn had liked to sit and read in the late afternoons, and he had decided that if his daughter came home for an evening, as she sometimes did on Nightscale's back, the great shadow of the dragon sweeping low over the rooftops and his neighbors coming out to wave, Delilah should find the place looking, as much as he could manage, the way her mother had left it. The horn carried across the hills from the south. He knew that pattern. He had been a younger son in a noble house once, and they had been made to memorize it as children. The long single note reserved for an army. He had never heard it sounded in his life. None of his generation had. He stood up slowly. His knees hurt now in a way they had not hurt last year. He looked south. The horizon there was pale in a way he did not like. He took off his gardening gloves and laid them on the bench beside the rosemary. He went into the house to find his old riding boots. They flew south at first light. The horn had blown for less than an hour before the southern garrison sent its own rider, a young captain named Ira, who had ridden through the night and arrived spitting blood from a split lip, and a horse that died at the gatehouse. She had nothing to add to what the refugees from Greyvale had already said, only that the army the horn announced was not yet visible, only that the men on the southern walls had seen, 3 times across the night, dark shapes moving along the high ridges in a way that did not match deer or wolves or men. Only that the ground at the foot of the wall had begun to grow cold. Cold, she said, not warm with fire. Cold, as if the stones were forgetting what summer was. Delilah had not slept. Owain had not slept. They had spent the first half of the night with maps, and the second half with the slab, and at some point near dawn, Delilah had walked out into the plaza and stood beside Nightscale for a long time without speaking. He had laid his great head down on the flagstones beside her, so that one amber eye was level with hers, and the bond had carried a single word between them, slow and exhausted. Together. She had nodded once. He had not needed her to say anything back. Now the orchards were beneath them again, and the river bend, and the long road south, and the ash was thicker here, falling steady and gray. The sheep in the orchards had moved up against the hedges and were standing very still. The crows in the upper branches had stopped calling. There was no wind. 2 months of riding Nightscale had taught Delilah that there was always wind at this height. Always. Today there was none, and his great wings had to do more of the work than they should, and she could feel the strain of it under her thighs. Greyvale appeared over the second ridge of hills. From the air it looked at first normal, a small town. 3 streets meeting at a central square, a mill on the western edge with its wheel still turning, smoke from no chimneys, no one in the streets, no one in the fields, no horses in the paddock at the south end of town, no goats. The fields around the town were green with summer barley and standing untouched. The bread oven on the back of the inn was cold. Nothing burned, nothing broken, just empty. Nightscale landed on the road outside the town walls. He would not enter. The bond carried his refusal as a low warning behind her teeth. The air is wrong here, little one. The air is wrong. And she did not argue with him. She slid down. She walked the last 100 yards in alone, with a hunting knife at her belt that would not have been any use against anything they were afraid of, and her left palm open at her side, because the bond carried better when her hand was not closed. The first body was not a body. It was a doll, a child's doll, lying in the middle of the main street, stuffed with straw, button eyes, a small painted mouth. It had been placed deliberately upright with its back against a cobblestone, facing the center of town, as if it had been told to watch. Delilah did not pick it up. She walked past it. She walked past the open door of the bakery, past loaves still sitting on the wooden counter, past a wheel of cheese with a knife laid neatly beside it. She walked past the doors of 3 houses, all of them open, all of them showing rooms inside that had been arranged with the same eerie tidiness. A chair pushed in, a cup placed on a table, a child's shoes set together neatly on the floor by a bed. She passed the smithy. The forge was cold. The hammer hung on its hook. A horseshoe sat half-finished on the anvil. She could see very faintly where the smith's apron had been laid down across the bellows lever. Folded. Folded the way her mother had folded laundry. She reached the square. The well at its center was gone. In its place was the hole. The refugee woman had been wrong about its diameter, closer to 6 feet across than 4, perfectly round, the edges of the cut stone as smooth as if a great blade had passed through. Around it, exactly as the woman had said, the cobbles had been lifted and reset into a wheel pattern. 7 spokes radiating outward, each spoke laid with stones that had been turned so that the same edge, the edge that had once faced down into the earth, now faced up. Pale undersides, black topsides. A wheel of dark and light. The air above the hole was visibly cold. A small column of white vapor rose from it as the morning's heat met whatever was below. She heard him before she saw him. A small sound, a foot on a roof tile, a scrape. She turned slowly. On the roof of the chandler's shop, 10 feet up, an old man was crouched against the chimney with a long-bladed hunting knife in one hand and the other hand pressed against his own mouth to keep himself from making any sound at all. He was thin and weathered and dressed in undyed wool, and his eyes were the only things in the town that were moving. She held up her empty hand. He stayed where he was for a long count of breaths. Then, very slowly, he came down off the roof by way of a stack of empty barrels and walked to her across the square in a wide arc that kept the wheel of cobbles always to his right. He did not cross over it. "You're the one. The dragon girl." Delilah Denilson. Cassian. Hunter. I was up in the high pastures 3 nights ago when they came. Who came? He laughed, a small, ugly laugh that had no humor in it at all. You'll see them. They come back at dusk. Every dusk. They take whatever else is left. He had been 3 miles above the town, he said, sleeping rough in a high pasture where he sometimes spent a week at a time, tracking the wolves that came down out of the western hills in summer. He had seen the column of cold light first, a pillar, he said, very thin, no wider than a man, rising out of where Greyvale sat. He had seen the column for less than a minute. Then he had seen the figures, 6 of them, then 12, then more than he could count, walking up out of the center of the town and fanning out into the streets. He had used the word walking with the deliberate slowness of a man who had been arguing with that word for 3 days. Walking, yes. Not crawling, not floating, not stalking. Walking. The way a man walks home from his own field. Tall, he said, taller than men, long-limbed, pale in a way that did not look like skin, more like the color of old bone left in the sun. They had carried weapons, long-hafted, black-bladed, glassy. They had moved without speaking. They had gone into the houses one at a time and come out one at a time, and each time they had come out, they had been carrying someone, and the someone had not been struggling. That was the part Cassian could not get past. Not the color of them, not the weapons, not the silence, the not struggling. They put their hand on the back of your neck, and you go. You walk with them, down into the hole, and then the next one comes up, and then the next. How long did it take? All night. They were patient. They took every single one of them. They put the doll where it is at the very end. The little Brennan girl had been holding it. They took her, and they put the doll down where she would have been if she were still there. As a... He shook his head. He could not find the word. As a marker. Yes, as a marker. She let him talk because letting him talk was the only useful thing she had to offer him at that moment. She let him talk about his sister, whose name had been Mara, and his sister's husband, whose name had been Tom, and his sister's daughter, who had been 6 years old and had called him Uncle Cass, and had been afraid of cows and not afraid of much else. She did not interrupt. She did not tell him she was sorry. She let him say all of their names out loud once in the empty square, because she suspected that he had been the only living thing in 3 days that had heard them said. When he was finished, he wiped his face on his sleeve once, hard. There is a cave above the pasture. The old hill people put a door across it long ago, stone door. There's writing on it like the writing on the cobbles. I think the thing in this hole came from somewhere. And if it came from somewhere, then somewhere is a place I'd like to see. Take me. He nodded once. He did not ask why she was unarmed. He did not ask where the dragon was. He had the practical economy of a man who had decided, sometime during the second day of hiding on a roof, that he had stopped being afraid of dying and started being afraid only of dying for nothing. 200 miles to the north, in a small, whitewashed room at the back of the dragon sanctuary at Mossvale, Lord Victor Ashford was on his knees mucking out the trough of a year-old wormling named Cinder. He had been on his knees most mornings for 2 months. The discipline was specific. He had been deeded by Delilah's order and the writ of the new Council of Restoration into the lifelong service of the 5 dragon sanctuaries founded in the wake of the arena's fall. He rotated among them. He cleaned the troughs. He hauled water. He scraped scale rot from old wounds. The sanctuary stewards had been instructed, also by Delilah's order, to address him by his first name and never by his title, and to require of him the exact same labor they required of every other ward. They did this with the relish of people who had spent years watching men like him eat off silver while their families starved. Cinder, who had been a fledgling once in some noble's private menagerie and had a broken left wing that would never heal straight, had taken a particular dislike to Ashford in the first week and had attempted to bite him on 3 separate occasions. The dragons knew. The dragons all knew. He had not yet been bitten successfully, but he had begun quietly to suspect that it was a matter of time. He was wringing out a rag into a bucket when the stable boy came running in with the news from the south. "Greyvale, sir, the rider just came. The whole town, they're all gone. There's a hole in the ground and there's things coming out of it." Ashford did not look up from the bucket. He had spent 20 years being told what was in the dungeons beneath his arena. He had been told it was a dragon. He had been told it was Prophet. He had been told on certain very late nights when he had drunk more wine than he should and walked alone down the long stair to the harvesting chamber that there had been something else in those depths, that the dragon had not been afraid of him, but of something further down. He had laughed about it the next morning. He had told himself he had imagined it. He had told himself there was only one valuable creature beneath that arena, and he had it in chains. And what could be further down than the bottom? Now, 2 months too late, in a room that smelled of straw and old reptile musk, with a rag in his hand and a stable boy staring at him, he understood that he had been asked 20 years ago to do a job that the universe had needed done. Not the job he thought he was doing. Not bone harvesting. Not gold. The job had been to keep Nightscale in those chains, to keep the bond from forming, to keep the first lock closed. He had done it badly. He had done it for the wrong reasons. He had done it for 2 decades, and then he had failed at it because he had grown greedy enough to put a Dragonheart girl into his arena to die quickly. And she had not died. He set the rag down on the rim of the bucket. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he should have been the first man Delilah killed. Tell the steward to send a rider after that rider. Tell him the hollow has begun. Tell him that this is what we did. Tell him I said it. Use my name. The boy went pale and ran. Ashford picked the rag back up and finished cleaning the trough. There were no other useful gestures available to him. He had spent 40 years acquiring power, and now, on his knees in a stall in Mossvale, he discovered that the only honest thing left for him to do was to keep doing exactly what he had been told to do until the end. He found, to his surprise, that this was not unbearable. Cinder, watching him from the corner of the stall with one yellow eye, declined to bite him that morning. Possibly out of pity. Possibly because she had begun, in her own slow reptile way, to take the measure of what was coming and to set certain old grudges aside in favor of larger ones. The cave above Greyvale was a 1/4 mile up the ridge. Cassian led her up the goat path with the practiced quickness of a man who had walked it 1,000 times. Nightscale paced them from above, his great shadow flicking across the stone, his amber eye visible whenever Delilah looked up. The bond kept the strain of his flight at a low, constant pulse behind her ribs. The air was cooling fast, not from height, she realized, but from the cave mouth itself, which they reached as the sun cleared the ridge. The door was real. A great slab of dark basalt, set into the rock face with iron pins thicker than her wrist. Across its surface, lines of red script flickered faintly in the rising morning, the same script that had begun appearing along old stones across the kingdom in the weeks since she had broken the first seal. She could read this one easily. Here ends the road. Beyond is the road that was lost. Bring no light. Bring no blood. Bring no blood. Yeah, maybe stand back. She did not stand back. She knelt at the foot of the door and laid her palm flat against the basalt. The script flickered brighter, then dimmer. Then a single new line resolved itself in the stone. Not in the old language now, but in the trade common she had spoken every day of her life, as if the door were translating itself for the person who happened to be standing in front of it. The first lock is opened. The watcher walks. The road is no longer lost. Run. The basalt door cracked across its center with a sound like a tree splitting in winter. It did not fall. It only cracked. And out of the crack, slowly, like an exhalation, came a thin column of cold white vapor that smelled of nothing at all. Not earth, not stone, not death, not metal. The absence of any smell. The smell of a room that had been closed for a very long time and had finished making its own air. From below the column, a voice spoke. It was not loud. It was not in the air. It was in the bone of her skull, the way Nightscale's voice was in the bone of her skull, except that Nightscale's voice had warmth in it, and this one did not. Daughter of the first, you have lifted the first key. 3 more, and the door opens. Open it, or do not. Either is the same to me. She did not answer. The bond between her and Nightscale flared so bright behind her sternum that she felt her own pulse jump. Above them, in the air, Nightscale dropped 100 feet in a single beat of his wings, and the wind of him broke the column of cold vapor and scattered it across the ridge. The voice, unbothered, finished its sentence. Patience is a luxury of the buried. I have practiced it. Your father has not. Cassian had stopped breathing. She could hear it. He had been holding his breath since the door cracked, and he had not let it out. She put her hand on his shoulder. She turned him gently away from the door. Behind them, in the meadow at the foot of the ridge, the first of the hollow walkers stepped out of the long grass. 3 of them, tall and pale, exactly as he had described. The black-bladed weapons in their long hands looked, in the early sunlight, less like swords than like sections of frozen river. Their eyes had no whites. Their eyes had no anything. They were standing perfectly still, 3 figures placed in the field like markers, and as Delilah turned to look at them, all 3 of them tilted their heads in exact unison, like birds. The right side, the left side, forward, looking at her. Nightscale came down on them out of the morning sun. She had seen him fight only twice before. Once in the arena 2 months ago, when he had pinned Ashford against the wall, and once, briefly, against 3 river bandits who had tried to ambush a sanctuary caravan on the road north. Neither encounter had prepared her for what he did now. There was no roar. He did not breathe fire. He came in at full diving speed, folded his wings at the last possible second, and broke the first hollow walker across the meadow with a single sweep of his foreclaw, the way a man might shatter a wine cup against a stone wall in temper. The other two moved at the same instant. They moved faster than men. The black blades came up, and where they passed through the air itself went silent. The small sounds of insects and grass and wind cutting out cleanly in a sphere around each blade. One of the blades found Nightscale's flank. It did not glance off. It did not skid along scale. It went in. The dragon's roar this time was a thing she felt in her own chest, a sound so large the ridge dust lifted from the path beneath her boots. He rolled away, ripping the blade out of his own side, and the wound he left behind was not red. It was black. Black blood. Cold steam. The wound was not bleeding the way a wound bleeds. It was leaking the way a thing leaks when something has reached inside it and pulled out the warmth. Delilah ran. She ran toward him. Cassian, who owed her nothing and who had every reason on earth to keep running up the ridge into the cave whose door she had not yet finished opening. Cassian ran down. He ran at the second hollow walker with his hunting knife held wrong, the way a man holds a knife when he has not held one in a fight in 20 years and is doing it anyway. And he reached the figure, and he buried the blade up to its haft in what would have been the soft place under a man's ribs, and the hollow walker did not stop. The walker did not stop. It looked down at the knife almost curiously, and then it reached up with its free hand and it placed its palm flat against the back of Cassian's neck. The way they did, he had said, the hand on the neck. Cassian's eyes went out. He did not fall. He did not bleed. He simply stopped, went still and pale and silent, with his knife still buried to the haft in a creature that had not been bothered by it. And then he turned, very calmly, and began to walk toward the broken door in the cliff face, the way a man walks home from his own field. No! Nightscale came down on the second walker before it could finish the turn. He took its head off with his teeth. The body fell, and the cold steam that came up from the stump was the same color as the air over the well in Greyvale. And Cassian, 3 paces from the door, stopped walking. He stood very still. He turned around once, slowly, as if he were trying to remember the question someone had just asked him. And then his eyes came back. Came back as a man's eyes. Came back, then went out again, this time in the ordinary mortal way, and he folded forward into the grass and did not move. The third hollow walker was already gone. She had not seen it leave. It had simply not been there. She knelt beside Cassian. She put 2 fingers against the side of his throat. There was nothing. The hand on his neck had taken whatever the hand on the neck took. He had been alive long enough to come back and choose to die as himself instead of walking the rest of the way. And that, she decided as she crouched in the meadow grass with ash falling on her shoulders, was a thing she would remember for as long as she lived. Above the broken cave door, the script flickered one final time. 3 to go. He had said it without anger. He had said it the way an old man tells a younger man about the inevitability of winter. Patience is a luxury of the buried. Delilah stood up. Around her, on the southern wind, the ash was beginning to fall thicker. To the east, very faint, the color of the sky over the next ridge had begun to change. Not red, not orange. A pale gray-white, as if the sun had been replaced with a hole. Nightscale settled beside her. His side was still leaking. His amber eye was open. His head lowered until his great brow rested against the side of her ribs, and he held it there, and the bond carried the only thing he could carry to her. Together. Together. The War Council convened at midnight in what had been Ashford's audience chamber and was now the working hall of the new Council of Restoration. There were 14 seats around the long oak table. 11 were filled. 3 of Valcrest's surviving lords, 2 captains of the Southern Guard, Captain Era of the garrison, Father Owain, the steward of the Mossvale Sanctuary, the matron of the Greyvale Orphanage now sheltering Mira, Delilah herself, and at the far end, in a plain wooden chair with iron at his wrists for the look of it, though everyone in the room knew the iron was Theodore, Lord Victor Ashford. He had asked to come. The council had voted 6-5 to allow it. The 3 empty chairs were for the lords of the southern provinces, who had stopped sending messengers 2 days before and were now presumed under the hollow. Owain spoke first. He had not slept in 3 days. His hands shook so badly he had stopped trying to hold the manuscript, and he had laid it open on the oak in front of him, and he spoke from memory, his eyes closed. There are 7 seals. They were set 400 years ago at the end of the war the histories do not tell. The first sat beneath Grimhold and is now broken. The second sits beneath a place called Brenlow, 3 days' ride to the east, in what is now wheat country. The third lies under the high pass at Sorrel. The fourth, we believe, lies under the floor of the chapel in Avonrest. The 5th, the 6th, the 7th, we don't know. The records were destroyed deliberately by the Aldermoot order at the close of the war. They did not want anyone to know where the seals were. They were afraid that if a Dragonheart line survived, a child would do exactly what... He stopped. He opened his eyes. He looked at Delilah. What was done? What I did. What you did, yes, to save your life, which we are all glad you did, and which has begun what we are all now sitting here, trying to think how to end. One of the southern captains, a thick-shouldered man named Aldrich, who had not stopped looking at the iron on Ashford's wrists throughout the speech, leaned forward. How do we close it? We don't know. You don't know. There is one line in the manuscript I have. One line. It says, "The lock that is broken can be set again, but only at the price the sealmaker paid." Which is what? Owain looked at Delilah again. She thought, in that moment, that she had never seen anyone in her life so reluctant to say something. The original sealmakers were Dragonhearts. 7 of them. They each gave their bond to the lock. The dragon and the Dragonheart died together when the seal closed. The bond was the lock. The lock is the bond. To reset it, the same price has to be paid. The room went perfectly still. Both of you. The girl and the dragon. Both of you. Together. Yes. To close one of 7 that we know of, 3 of which we have any idea where they are. Yes. Aldrich leaned back in his chair. He looked for a long moment at the empty chairs along the southern side of the table. Then he closed his eyes. It was Ashford who spoke next, from the foot of the table, in the dry, careful voice of a man who had decided long ago what he was going to say in this room and was simply waiting for the opening. He spoke as if iron had not been an issue, as if no one were watching him, as if he were giving the kind of report he had once given to kings, with the same dry assurance. There is a second option, and I will tell you what it is because you will not hear it from anyone else in this room, and we no longer have time for delicacy. Owain's head came up. There is an old practice. It is in the records I had, the records I burned, the records I kept the worst of. I kept them because I thought one day I might need them. I never had the courage to use them, and now I am offering them. The practice is called the vessel. A Dragonheart can pass the burden of a broken seal, not into themselves and their dragon, but into a third person, someone of the same blood, a near kin, a father, a sibling, a child. The vessel takes the seal into their own body. They become the lock. Their life sustains it. They cannot leave its place. They cannot, in any practical sense, ever go home. But they live. And the dragon? Lives. The bond holds. The Dragonheart walks away.
The room said nothing. It is not painless. I want to be clear. It is not painless and it is not easy. And the vessel will live the rest of their life on a leash of their own blood. But they live. The seal closes. The dragon survives. The Dragonheart survives. The kingdom survives. 1 of 7. We will have time to find a way to close the rest. We will not have any time at all if everyone in this room dies in the next 4 days. Delilah did not look at him. She was looking at Owain. Owain was looking at the manuscript. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a book that has just told him something it should not have told him. It's true. I have seen the reference. I did not understand it. He has the words he just used. Those are the words from the burned text. He has read it. He has read it more recently than I have. I have read it more recently than anyone alive. I am not proud. Delilah looked at him then. For the first time since he had come into the room, he met her eyes. He did not look away. Why are you telling us this? Because I would like, in the very small remaining portion of my life that I will be permitted, to have done one thing that was not for myself. And because I happen to know, and now his voice did go quieter, that there is at least one man in your service who would volunteer for the role of vessel before sundown if you asked him, and possibly before sundown if you did not. She stood up. She walked the length of the council chamber. She walked out the side door. She found her father in the small herb garden behind the kitchens. He was sitting on the bench beside the rosemary, the way he had sat on benches beside rosemary at their old manor when he had wanted to be alone and had not wanted to look as if he wanted to be alone. His hair had gone fully gray in 2 months. He had lost weight he did not have to lose. He looked up when she came around the corner, and what she saw on his face was nothing at all like surprise. You heard. I was listening through the kitchen window. Old habit. Father, I'll do it. No. Yes. No. He took her hand. The first time he had done it since the night 2 months ago, when he had knelt in the arena sand and she had pulled him up. You sold me. I sold you. We have agreed on this between us. We have agreed that you are not required to forgive me, and that we will try to build something anyway. And we have been trying. I have been trying every day. And we are getting somewhere. But Delilah... He looked at her. You have been bearing the weight of the lock since you broke it. I have watched you bear it. You think I don't see, but I see. You are 19 years old, and you go to bed every night with the knowledge that thousands of people are about to die because of something you did to save your life. That is too much for any one person, and it is too much for you specifically. And I will not let you carry that into a sealing chamber and trade your dragon for a kingdom. I have already taken one thing from you that I cannot give back. Let me give this back instead. You'll never leave it. The breach. You'll have to stay there. You won't come home. I sold you to an arena to make you go far away. I have already practiced not coming home. She put her hand over her mouth. She put both hands over her mouth. She did not cry. She had not cried since the day she had come out of the arena, and she did not cry now. But her shoulders shook the way a person's shoulders shake when they are working very hard not to. He kept holding her other hand. Let me. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She squeezed his hand once, very hard, and turned and went back inside. The army came up out of the breach 2 days later, 3 hours before dawn. The breach at Greyvale was no longer the well-sized hole that Cassian had described. It had widened in stages. By the afternoon of the first day, a wagon could have driven down into it. By the morning of the second day, it was wide enough that the Southern Guard had been pulled back twice for fear of the ground at its edge. By the third dawn, the road between Greyvale and Valcrest was a steady, slow procession of cold-eyed figures with black glass weapons, walking in patient ranks, and behind them, riding tall horses that were not horses, banner-bearers with standards that did not catch any wind. Above them, the sky over the southern horizon had gone pale gray-white, the whole instead of the sun. They met them at the river. Delilah did not ride a horse. She rode Nightscale, and Nightscale was not alone in the sky. She had not asked for the others to come. The others had come anyway. Of the 5 dragons who had been freed from noble menageries in the weeks after the arena's fall, 4 had been strong enough to fly to Valcrest within the day Owain had sent word south by every fast rider the sanctuaries had. They had come in one by one across the second night. A green-bronze female out of the Mossvale collection, a fledgling pair who flew together as if neither of them had ever been alone, and old Vorik, who had been a court mascot for an Eastern Nord and had not flown more than a quarter mile at a time in 15 years, and arrived breathing hard, but arrived. Cinder, the wormling with the broken wing, would not fly. Cinder had hitched a wagon ride and was sitting now, half-grown and indignant, behind the front lines, attempting to set the supply tents on fire whenever the supply officers were not looking. The 5th dragon had not come. The 5th had been a half-grown male too newly traumatized to fly. Delilah did not begrudge him. She would not have begrudged any of them. She had not asked. They came in over the river at first light. The black glass wound in Nightscale's flank had closed, but not in the way wounds close. By the second night, Owain had packed it with crushed bone meal and ash from the basalt door, the only thing that had stopped the cold leak, and a thin black scar now ran 2 feet along his side, cool to the touch, where the rest of him ran hot. He could fly. He could fly hard. But the bond carried, under everything now, a thin, steady ache on his left side that he did not name, and Delilah did not name, and they both heard at every wing beat. Owain said the cold was still in him. Owain said it would not leave him. 5 dragons in the air, 4 of them new to the sun, 3 of them never having flown in formation with anything in their lives, and yet they had taken up Nightscale's lead like a thing remembered, wing to wing, the green bronze on his left, the paired fledglings high above, old Vorik a steady flank below, and the hollow lines on the far bank had looked up at them and stopped walking. For one breath. For two. Then a horn sounded somewhere in the column, and the black-bladed weapons came up. The battle that followed was, by the measure of the histories written afterward, the largest single engagement fought above Valcrest in 300 years, and the shortest in the same period. It lasted 90 minutes. It cost the Southern Guard 412 men, and the Hollow what no one could afterward calculate, because the Hollow Walkers did not leave bodies behind in the conventional sense. When they were killed, they leaked their cold for a few minutes, and then they were not there. The cavalry charge across the upper ford was led by Captain Era on a horse she did not survive, but the charge did. The defense of the eastern hill was held by a line of Valcrest militia and a half-grown wormling who was meant to be in the wagon and was not. The skies belonged to the 5 dragons for the first 40 minutes, and to the Hollow's Black Banner riders for the next 20, and then to the dragons again. Old Vorik went down over the riverbank and did not come up. The green bronze took a black blade across her wing membrane and kept flying for another quarter of an hour before she folded into the meadow and was carried out alive by 12 men with a pallet. Nightscale did not fall. He did not fall because Delilah did not allow him to. And he did not allow her to fall either, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour of fighting, they had stopped being two and become a single moving thing that turned in the air like a single body. The bond at full pitch had no language in it. It had only weight. Every breath he took, she felt. Every blow he struck, her arm remembered. Every cold blade that came near him bent away at the last instant because she had seen it coming a half-second before he had, from the angle her seat on his shoulders allowed. When the front of the Hollow column broke at last on the river ford, when the Hollow King's banner-bearer turned and began the long, slow retreat back toward the breach, Delilah looked down and saw, walking up the eastern slope alone toward the dragon line, the small figure of her father. He had a satchel over one shoulder. He had a long knife at his belt. He had Mira's hand in his. Mira. The 7-year-old child who had been promised to stay in the sanctuary and who, by some method involving the supply wagons and a complete disregard for adult instruction, had not stayed in the sanctuary. She was walking up the slope beside Richard with her hazel eyes very wide and her free hand wrapped tightly around the strap of his satchel, and Delilah understood, in one terrible flat moment, that her father had decided something on his own. She brought Nightscale down on the slope in front of them. "What are you doing?" "What I told you I would do." "You said the breach, not here, not— What is she doing here?" "She climbed into the wagon, and the supply officer didn't see. And by the time anyone noticed, she was halfway here, and Delilah, there was no time to send her back. So I brought her. She's going to walk with me to the breach. She's going to walk with me because Owain says— Owain says what?" "That a vessel can be young." "No, it is not what you think. Listen, she is not. She will not be the vessel. I am the vessel. But Owain says— Delilah, the seal can hold longer if there are two, not bonded to it, just present, a second voice in it, a child of the line. She does not bleed. She does not pay. She only visits, sometimes, once a season, and in exchange, the seal holds for 30 years instead of 3. That is the cost of bringing her. That is the only cost. She has been told. She agreed."
Delilah looked at the child. Mira looked back.
He told me I get to be a princess of the Underplace, and I asked him if that meant I had to live there, and he said no. And I asked him if it would hurt, and he said no. And I asked him if I would see my mother, and he said no. My mother is gone, but he would teach me her name. And I want...
She looked at her boots. She looked back up.
I want him to teach me her name.
Delilah went down on her knees in the wet meadow grass. She did not say anything for a long time. Nightscale lowered his great head and rested it against her back. The bond held. The bond was warm. The bond was hers and would stay hers.
Father?
Yes.
Walk slowly.
Don't make me catch up to you. Walk slowly so I can walk with you. So they walked down together, the three of them, with the dragon pacing them in the sky. The breach was a mile across now. The Hollow King's army had drawn back into it as the dragons drove them, and what remained at its lip was a vast circle of cold, pale stone in which 7 steps led down. The steps had not been there before. The steps had been a road that was lost, and now the first seal's failure had begun to remember the road, and the steps were rising out of the earth, one at a time. They descended 6. The 7th step would have taken them into the hollow itself. They stopped at 6. On the platform at the foot of the 6th step was the altar, not stone now, a pale ring of bone and frost set into the earth, with the dragon script of the first language burned around it in faint living red, and at its center, a single shallow basin. Owain had walked down the steps behind them. Owain had not, in the end, let her go alone. He carried a long knife and a clay flask of water and a small scroll that he had been writing on through the night, and when they reached the basin, he set the scroll down on its rim and unrolled it. He read. He read for a long time. The words were the first language, and Delilah could feel them in her teeth. When he was done, Richard knelt at the basin. He held out his hand. He turned his palm up. Owain took the knife, the long knife with the bone handle, and made one clean horizontal cut along Richard's palm. He bled into the basin. He bled a long time. The blood did not pool. The blood sank in. The script around the basin's rim burned brighter as it sank. The basin began to hum, low and steady, like a bell that had been struck a long time ago and was still ringing. Mira knelt at the basin's other side. She did not bleed. She only laid her small hand on the bone rim, and the rim warmed under her palm, and she said, in a voice that was not adult and not a child's anymore, but something quieter than either, "I'm here." The basin hummed louder. The script burned brighter. The road behind them, the steps, began to descend back into the earth, one at a time. The 7th was already gone. The 6th went. The 5th. Richard looked up at Delilah. "Tell your dragon that I am sorry I never thanked him for keeping you alive." "Father." "And tell Mira's matron that she will visit twice a year, once at planting, once at harvest, and I will teach her her mother's name, and many other things." The 4th step went, the 3rd. They were running out of road. She bent. She kissed him on the forehead. She kissed him for the first time in 5 years. "I'll come at planting too." "I know." She went back up the steps with Owain. They climbed the last 2 before they disappeared. They stood at the rim of the breach as the basin's hum rose into a single high, pure note, and the cold, pale stone of the great circle began to draw inward, slowly, like a wound closing. Not all the way.
Not yet. The breach would never fully close, but it shrank. It shrank to the width of a small courtyard. The pale gray-white in the southern sky began, very slowly, to color back toward blue. It would not be blue again for a year. Owain told her this in the days that followed. The sun, he said, had been borrowing some of its light from the place beneath the world for as long as anyone remembered, and now that the loan had been called in, the light would come back the way debts come back, in pieces, over time. She did not mind. She had spent 2 months learning to live with darker mornings. Below them, at the basin she could no longer see, her father had begun to keep a small garden. Mira told her about it at planting, 3 months later, when the child came up out of the breach holding a sprig of rosemary and a clay cup of tea that her father had made her in a kitchen no one else could find. Mira had grown an inch. Her hazel eyes had a new color at the edges, a quiet ringed silver that Delilah did not ask about. Mira sat on Nightscale's foreclaw and ate 3 pears in a row and said her mother's name out loud for the first time. Anise, it had been. Anise of the salt ports. And Delilah wrote it down for her on a piece of vellum, and the child put it in her pocket and went back down into the breach at sundown the way other children went back into their own houses. 2 of the 7 seals were now closed. The first, by her father's blood and a small child's hand. The 4th, by a different family in a different province a month later, when Owain's scribes had ridden out with the practice in scroll form and found, in a chapel in Avonrest, a seal that had begun to weep. The first break's shock had traveled through the deep stone and split a hairline crack in the next nearest lock. And a man and his grown son who said yes. 5 remained. The Hollow King had not spoken again. The ash had stopped falling in Valcrest by the end of the first month, though it still fell in the southern provinces, and Father Owain said it would fall there for as long as any of them were alive. Cassian was buried in the meadow above Greyvale where he had fallen. Delilah went to his grave at midsummer and stood there a long time. She had not known him for a full day. He had given his death for her and for a child he had never met. She left a small black stone from the basin's rim on his grave mound, and on the way down, she stopped at the empty bakery in Greyvale and took, finally, the doll that had been set in the road, and she carried it home, and she gave it to Mira. Nightscale stayed. She had been afraid, she would admit this later only to him, that the seal closing had cost them something neither of them had agreed to. She had been afraid she would wake one morning and the bond would be a little quieter, and a little quieter the next, and that one day she would wake and the bond would be gone, and her dragon would be a creature she happened to ride, and not the second beat of her own pulse. This did not happen. The bond stayed. The bond, if anything, deepened, not with new information, but with the silent agreement of 2 creatures who had now, between them, walked down stone steps into the place beneath the world and come back up. They flew often. They flew at dawn over the orchards, where the ash no longer fell. They flew over the breach at midnight sometimes, when she could not sleep, and circled it slowly, and Nightscale would say nothing, and she would say nothing, and the bond would say everything that needed saying. 5 seals remained. A child she had not chosen now visited her father in a kitchen no one else could find. The road that was still lost, but it was lost again, and that, for now, was enough.
Richard sold his daughter once, and that was wrong, and then he gave the rest of his life back to her, and that was love, and only 2 months stood between the 2 acts. If there's someone in your life still trying to find their way back to you the long way around, you probably know who I mean. Tell them what you've been needing them to know. Don't wait until they're walking down stone stairs to do it. And if you want to stay with Delilah while 5 seals still stand between her and the end of this, keep flying with us. The road's only getting longer from here.